Hello and welcome to the next reading from It Shouldn't Happen to a Vet by James Herriot. Tonight I read chapters 16, 17 and 18 of the 33 chapters that appear in this book. So, chapter 16. Vets are useless creatures, parasites on the agricultural community, expensive layabouts who really know nothing about animals or their diseases. You might as well get Jeff Mallet, the knacker man, as send for a vet. At least that was the opinion frequently expressed of the Sidlow family. In fact, when you came right down to it, just about the only person for miles around who knew how to treat sick beasts was Mr. Sidlow himself. If any of their cows or horses fell ill, it was Mr. Sidlow who stepped forward with his armoury of sovereign remedies. He enjoyed a godlike prestige with his wife and large family, and it was an article of their faith that father was infallible in these matters. The only other being who had ever approached his skill was long-dead Grandpa Sidlow, from whom father had learned so many of his cures. Mind you, Mr. Sidlow was a just and humane man. After maybe 5 or 6 days of dedicated nursing, during which he would perhaps push half a pound of lard and raisins down the cow's throat 3 times a day, rub its udder vigorously with turpentine, or maybe cut a bit off the end of the tail to let the bad out, he always in the end called the vet. Not that it would do any good, but he liked to give the animal every chance. When the vet arrived, he invariably found a sunken-eyed, dying creature, and the despairing treatment he gave was like a figurative administration of the last rites. The animal always died, so the Sidlows were repeatedly confirmed in their opinion. Vets were useless. The farm was situated outside the normal area of the practice, and we were the third firm Mr. Sidlow had dealt with. He had been a client of Greer of Broughton, but had found him wanting and moved to Wallace away over in Mansley. Wallace had disappointed him grievously, so he decided to try Darrowby. He had been with us for over a year, but it was an uncomfortable relationship because Siegfried had offended him deeply on his very first visit. It was to a moribund horse, and Mr. Sidlow, describing the treatment to date, announced that he had been pushing raw onions up the horse's rectum. He couldn't understand why it was so uneasy on its legs. Siegfried had pointed out that if he were to insert a raw onion in Mr. Sidlow's rectum, he, Mr. Sidlow, would undoubtedly be uneasy on his legs. It was a bad start, but there were really no other available vets left. He was stuck with us. I had been uncannily lucky in that I had been at Darrowby for more than a year and had never had to visit this farm. Mr. Sidlow rarely called us up during normal working hours, as after wrestling with his conscience for a few days, he always seemed to lose the battle around 11 o'clock at night. He made exceptions in the case of the occasional Sunday afternoon, and it had always landed on Siegfried's duty nights. It was Siegfried who had trailed out, swearing quietly, and returned slightly pop-eyed in the small hours. So when it did finally come round to my turn, I didn't rush out with any great enthusiasm, even though the case was just a choking bullock and should present no difficulties. This was when a beast got a piece of turnip or a potato stuck in its gullet, preventing regurgitation of gases and causing bloating, which can be fatal. We usually either relieve the bloat by puncturing the stomach, or we carefully push the obstruction down into the stomach by means of a long, flexible leather instrument called a probang. Anyway, they had realised they couldn't wait for days this time, and by way of a change it was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The farm was nearer Broughton than Darrowby, and lay in the low country down on the plain of York. I didn't like the look of the place. There was something depressing about the dilapidated brick buildings and the dreary setting of ploughing land, with only the occasional mound of a potato clamp to relieve the flatness. My first sight of Mr. Sidlow reminded me that he and his family were members of a fanatically narrow religious sect. I had seen that gaunt, blue-jowled face, with the tortured eyes staring at me from the pages of history books long ago. I had the feeling that Mr. Sidlow would have burnt me at the stake without a qualm. The bullock was in a gloomy box off the fold yard. Several of the family had filed in with us, 2 young men in their 20s and 3 teenage girls, all good-looking in a dark gypsy way, but all with the same taut, unsmiling look as their father. As I moved around examining the animal, I noticed another peculiarity. They all looked at me, the bullock, each other, with quick sideways glances without any head movement. Nobody said anything. I would have liked to break the silence, but couldn't think of anything cheerful to say. This beast didn't have the look of an ordinary choke. I could feel the potato quite distinctly from the outside, halfway down the esophagus, but all around was an oedematous mass extending up and down the left side of the neck. Not only that, but there was a bloody foam dripping from the mouth. There was something funny here. A thought struck me. Have you been trying to push the potato down with something? I could almost feel the battery of flitting glances, and the muscles of Mr. Sidlow's clenched jaw stood out in a twitching ridge. He swallowed carefully. Aye, we've tried a bit. What did you use? Again the rippling jaw muscles under the dark skin. Broom handle and a bit of a hosepipe. Same as usual. That was enough. A sense of doom enveloped me. It would have been nice to be the first vet to make a good impression here, but it wasn't to be. I turned to the farmer. I'm afraid you've ruptured the gullet. It's a very delicate tube, you know, and you only have to push a bit too hard, and you're through. You see the fluid collection round the rupture? A quivering silence answered me. I ploughed on. I've seen this happen before. It's a pretty black-out look. All right, Mr. Sidlow ground out. What are you going to do about it? Well, we're at it now. What was I going to do about it? Maybe now, 30 years later, I might have tried to repair the gullet, packed the wound with antibiotic powder, and given a course of penicillin injections. But there in that cheerless place, looking at the patient animal, gulping painfully, coughing up the gouts of blood, I knew I was whacked. A ruptured esophagus was as near hopeless as anything could be. I searched my mind for a suitable speech. I'm sorry, Mr. Sidlow, but I can't do anything about it. The glances crackled around me, and the farmer breathed in sharply through his nose. I didn't need to be told what they were all thinking. Another no-good, useless vet. I took a deep breath and continued. Even if I shifted the potato, the wound would get contaminated when the beasts tried to eat. He'd have gangrene in no time, and that means a painful death. He's in pretty good condition. If I were you, I'd have him slaughtered immediately. The only reply was a virtuoso display from the jaw muscles. I tried another tack. I'll give you a certificate. I'm sure the meat will pass for the butcher. No cries of joy greeted this remark. If anything, Mr. Sidlow's expression became still more bleak. That beast isn't ready for killing yet, he whispered. No, but you'd be sending him in before long. Another month, maybe. I'm sure you won't lose much. I tell you what, with a ghastly attempt at heartiness, if I can come into the house, I'll write you this chit now and we'll get the job over. There's really nothing else for it. I turned and headed across the fold yard for the farm kitchen. Mr. Sidlow followed wordlessly with the family. I wrote the certificate quickly, waves of disapproval washing around me in the silent room. As I folded the paper, I had the sudden conviction that Mr. Sidlow wasn't going to pay the slightest attention to my advice. He was going to wait a day or two to see how things turned out. The picture of the big, uncomprehending animal trying vainly to swallow, as his hunger and thirst increased, was too strong for me. I walked over to the phone on the windowsill. I'll just give Harry Norman a ring at the abattoir. I know he'll come straight up if I ask him. I made the arrangements, hung up the receiver, and started for the door, addressing Mr. Sidlow's profile as I left. It's fixed. Harry will be along within half an hour. Much better to get it done immediately. Going across the yard, I had to fight the impulse to break into a gallop. As I got into the car, I recalled Siegfried's advice. In sticky situations, always get your car back round before you examine the animal. Leave the engine running if necessary. The quick getaway is essential." He was right. It took a long time reversing and manoeuvring under the battery of unseen eyes. I don't blush easily, but my face was burning as I finally left the farm. That was my first visit to the Sidlows, and I prayed that it might be my last, but my luck had run out. From then on, every time they sent for us, it just happened to be me on duty. I would rather not say anything about the cases I treated there, except to record that something went wrong every time. The very name Sidlow became like a jinx. Try as I might, I couldn't do a thing right on that farm, so that within a short time I was firmly established with the family as the greatest menace to the animal population they had ever encountered. They didn't think much of vets as a whole, and they'd met some real beauties in their time, but I was by far the worst. My position as the biggest nincompoop of them all was unassailable. It got so bad that if I saw any Sidlows in the town, I would dive down an alley to avoid them. And one day in the marketplace I had the unnerving experience of seeing the entire family, somehow jammed into a large old car, passing within a few feet of me. Every face looked rigidly to the front, but every eye I knew was trained balefully on me. Fortunately, I was just outside the drover's arms, so I was able to reel inside and steady myself with a half-pint of Younger's Special Heavy. However, the Sidlows were far from my mind on the Saturday morning when Siegfried asked me if I would go through and officiate at Broughton races. "They've asked me to do it as Greer is on holiday," he said, "but I'd already promised to go through to Casborough to help Dick Henley with a rig operation. I can't let him down. There's nothing much to the race job. The regular course vet will be there and he'll keep you right." He hadn't been gone more than a few minutes when there was a call from the racecourse. One of the horses had fallen while being unloaded from its box and had injured its knee. Would I come right away? Even now I am no expert on racehorses. They form a little branch of practice all by itself, with its own stresses, its own mystique. In my short spell in Darrowby, I had had very little to do with them, as Siegfried was fascinated by anything equine, and usually gobbled up anything in that line which came along, so my practical experience was negligible. I wasn't at all reassured when I saw my patient. The knee was a terrible mess. He had tripped at the bottom of the ramp and come down with his full weight on the stony ground. The lacerated skin hung down in bloody ribbons, exposing the joint capsule over an area of about 6 inches, and the extensor tendons gleamed through a tattered layer of fascia. The beautiful 3-year-old held the limb up, trembling, with the toe just touching the ground. The ravaged knee made a violent contrast with the sleek, carefully groomed coat. Examining the wound, gently feeling round the joint, I was immediately thankful for one thing. It was a quiet animal. Some light horses are so highly strung that the slightest touch sends them up in the air. But this one hardly moved as I tried to piece together the jigsaw of skin pieces. Another lucky break. There was nothing missing. I turned to the stable head lad, small, square, hands deep in his coat pockets, who was standing watching. "I'll clean up the wound and stitch it, but he'll need some expert care when you get him home. Can you tell me who will be treating him?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Brady Reynolds. He'll have charge of him." I came bolt upright from my crouching position. The name was like a trumpet call echoing down from my student days. When you talked about horses, you usually talked about Brady Reynolds sooner or later. I could imagine the great man inspecting my handiwork. "And who did you say treated this? Herriot? Herriot?" I got down to the job again with my heart beating faster. Mercifully, the joint capsule and tendon sheaths were undamaged. No escape of synovia. Using a solution of chinosol, I swabbed out every last cranny of the wound till the ground around me was white with cotton wool pledgets. Then I puffed in some iodoform powder and tacked down the loose shreds of fascia. Now the thing was to make a really good job of the skin to avoid disfigurement if possible. I chose some fine silk and a very small suture needle and squatted down again. I must have stayed there for nearly an hour, pulling the flaps of skin carefully into position and fastening them down with innumerable tiny sutures. There is a fascination in repairing a ragged wound, and I always took pains over it, even without an imaginary brainy Reynolds peering over my shoulder. When I finally straightened up, I did so slowly, like an old man easing the kinks from neck and back. With shaking knees, I looked down at the head lad almost without recognition. He was smiling. You've made a proper job of that, he said. It looks nearly as good as new. I want to thank you, sir. He's one of my favourites, not just because he's a good hoss, but he's kind. He patted the 3-year-old's flank. Well, I hope he does all right. I got out a packet of gauze and a bandage. I'm just going to cover up the knee with this, and then you can put on a stable bandage. I'll give him a shot against tetanus, and that's it. I was packing my gear away in the car, when the head lad hovered again at my side. Do you back horses? I laughed. No, hardly ever. Don't know much about it. Well, never mind. The little man looked around him and lowered his voice. But I'll tell you something to back this afternoon. Camel in the first race. He's one of ours and he's going to win. You get a nice price about him. Well, thanks. It'll give me something to do. I'll have half a crown on him. The tough little face screwed up in disgust. No, put a 5 on him. This is the goods, I mean it. Keep it to yourself, but get a 5 on him. He walked rapidly away. I don't know what madness took hold of me, but by the time I had got back to Darrowby, I'd decided to take his advice. There had been something compelling about that last horse whisper, and the utter confidence in the black pebble eyes. The little chap was trying to do me a good turn. I had noticed him glancing at my old jacket and rumpled flannels, so different from the natty outfit of the typical horse vet. Maybe he thought I needed the money. I dropped in at the Midland Bank and drew out £5, which at the time represented approximately half my available capital. I hurried round the remaining visits, had a quick lunch and got into my best suit. There was plenty of time to get to the course, meet the officials and get my 5 on Kemmel before the first race at 2:30. The phone rang just as I was about to leave the house. It was Mr. Sidlow. He had a scarring cow which needed attention immediately. It was fitting, I thought dully, that in my moment of eager anticipation it should be my old Jinx who should stretch out his cold hand and grasp. And it was Saturday afternoon. That was fitting too. But I shook myself. The farm was near Broughton, and it shouldn't take long to deal with a scarring cow. I could still make it. When I arrived, my immaculate appearance set up an immediate flurry of glances among the assembled family, while Mr. Sidlow's rigid lips and squared shoulders bore witness that he was prepared to endure another visit from me with courage. A numbness filled me as we went into the byre. It continues as Mr. Sidlow described how he had battled against this cow's recurring bouts of diarrhoea for several months, how he had started quietly with ground eggshells in gruel and worked up to his most powerful remedy, blue vitriol and dandelion tea, but all to no avail. I hardly heard him because it was fairly obvious at a glance that the cow had Jonas disease. Jonas disease. Nobody could be quite sure, of course, but the animal's advanced emaciation, especially in the hind end, and the stream of bubbly throated scour which she had ejected as I walked in were almost diagnostic. Instinctively I grasped her tail and thrust my thermometer into the rectum. I wasn't much interested in her temperature, but it gave me a couple of minutes to think. However, in this instance I got only about 5 seconds, because without warning the thermometer disappeared from my fingers. Some sudden suction had drawn it inside the cow. I ran my fingers round just inside the rectum. Nothing. I pushed my hand inside without success. With a feeling of rising panic, I rolled up my sleeve and groped about in vain. There was nothing else for it. I had to ask for a bucket of hot water, soap and a towel, and strip off as though preparing for some large undertaking. Over my 30-odd years in practice, I can recall many occasions when I looked a complete fool, but there is a peculiarly piercing quality about the memory of myself, bare to the waist, the centre of a ring of hostile stares, guddling frantically inside that cow. At the time, all I could think of was that this was in Sidlow Place, the Sidlow Place. Anything could happen here. In my mental turmoil, I had discarded all my knowledge of pathology and anatomy, and could visualise the little glass tube working its way rapidly along the intestinal tract until it finally pierced some vital organ. There was another hideous image of myself carrying out a major operation, a full-scale laparotomy on the cow to recover my thermometer. It is difficult to describe the glorious relief which flooded through me when at last I felt the thing between my fingers. I pulled it out, filthy and dripping, and stared down stupidly at the graduations on the tube. Mr. Sidlow cleared his throat. "Well, what does it say? Has she got a temperature?" I whipped round and gave him a piercing look. Was it possible that this man could be making a joke? But the dark, tight-shut face was expressionless. "No," I mumbled in reply. "No temperature." The rest of that visit had always been mercifully blurred in my mind. I know I got myself cleaned up and dressed, and told Mr. Sidlow that I thought his cow had Iona's disease, which was incurable, but I would take away a feces sample to try to make sure. The details are cloudy, but I do know that at no point was there the slightest gleam of light or hope. I left the farm bowed down by an even greater sense of disgrace than usual, and drove with my foot on the boards all the way to Broughton. I roared into the special car park at the racecourse, galloped through the owner's and trainer's entrance, and seized the arm of the gatekeeper. "Has the first race been run?" I gasped. "Aye, just finished," he replied cheerfully. "Kemmel won it 10-1. I turned and walked slowly towards the paddock. £50! A fortune snatched from my grasp by cruel fate, and hanging over the whole tragedy was the grim spectre of Mr. Sidlow. I could forgive Mr. Sidlow, I thought, for dragging me out at all sorts of ungodly hours. I could forgive him for presenting me with a long succession of hopeless cases which had lowered my self-esteem to rock bottom. I could forgive him for not thinking I was the biggest idiot in Yorkshire, and for proclaiming his opinion far and wide, but I'd never forgive him for losing me that £50. Chapter 17. The Reniston, eh? I fidgeted uneasily. Bit grand, isn't it? Tristan lay rather than sat in his favourite chair, and peered up through a cloud of cigarette smoke. "Of course it's grand. It's the most luxurious hotel in the country outside of London. But for your purpose, it's the only possible place. Look, tonight is your big chance, isn't it? You want to impress this girl, don't you? Well, ring her up and tell her you're taking her to the Reniston. The food is wonderful, and there's a dinner dance every Saturday night. And today is Saturday." He sat up suddenly and his eyes widened. "Can't you see it, Jim? The music oozing out of Benny Thornton's trombone, and you full of lobster thermidor, floating round the floor with Helen snuggling up to you. The only snag is that it will cost you a packet. But if you are prepared to spend about a fortnight's wages, you can have a really good night." I hardly heard the last part. I was concentrating on the blinding vision of Helen snuggling up to me. It was an image which blotted out things like money, and I stood with my mouth half open listening to the trombone. I could hear it quite clearly. Tristan broke in. "There's one thing. Have you got a dinner jacket? You'll need one." "Well, I'm not very well off for evening dress. In fact, when I went to Mrs. Pumphrey's party, I hired a suit from Broughton, but I wouldn't have time for that now." I paused and thought for a moment. "I do have my first and only dinner suit, but I got it when I was about 17, and I don't know whether I'd be able to get into it." Tristan waved this aside. He dragged the woodbine smoke into the far depths of his lungs, and released it reluctantly in little wisps and trickles as he spoke. "Doesn't matter in the least, Jim. As long as you're wearing the proper gear, they'll let you in. And with a big, good-looking chap like you, the fit of the suit is unimportant." We went upstairs and extracted the garment from the bottom of my trunk. I had cut quite a dash in this suit at the college dances, and though it had got very tight towards the end of the course, it had still been a genuine evening dress outfit, and as such had commanded a certain amount of respect. But now it had a pathetic lost look. The fashion had changed, and the trend was towards comfortable jackets and soft unstarched shirts. This one was rigidly of the old school, and included an absurd little waistcoat with lapels, and a stiff shiny-fronted shirt with a tall winged collar. My problems really started when I got the suit on. Hard work, Pennine air, and Mrs. Hall's good food had filled me out, and the jacket fell to meet across my stomach by 6 inches. I seemed to have got taller too, because there was a generous space between the bottom of the waistcoat and the top of the trousers. The trousers themselves were skin-tight over the buttocks, yet seemed foolishly baggy lower down. Tristan's confidence evaporated as I paraded before him, and he decided to call on Mrs. Hall for advice. She was an unemotional woman, and endured the irregular life at Skeldale House without noticeable reaction. But when she came into the bedroom and looked at me, her facial muscles went into a long twitching spasm. She finally overcame the weakness, however, and became very businesslike. "A little gusset at the back of your trousers will work wonders, Mr. Herriot, and I think if I put a bit of silk cord across the front of your jacket, it'll hold it nicely. Mind you, there'll be a bit of a space, like, but I shouldn't think that'll worry you. And I'll give the whole suit a good press. Makes all the difference in the world." I had never gone in much for intensive. I went to work on myself, scrubbing and anointing and trying a whole series of different partings in my hair before I was satisfied. Tristan seemed to have appointed himself master of the wardrobe, and carried the suit tenderly upstairs, still warm from Mrs. Hall's ironing board. Then, like a professional valet, he assisted in every step of the robing. The high collar gave most trouble, and he drew strangled oaths from me as he trapped the flesh of my neck under the stud. When I was finally arrayed, he walked around me several times, pulling and patting the material, and making delicate adjustments here and there. Eventually he stopped his circling and surveyed me from the front. I had never seen him look so serious. "Fine, Jim, fine. You look great. Distinguished, you know. It's not everybody who can wear a dinner jacket. So many people look like conjurers, but not you. Hang on a minute and I'll get your overcoat." I had arranged to pick up Helen at 7 o'clock, and as I climbed from the car in the darkness outside her house, a strange unease crept over me. This was different. When I had come here before, it had been as a veterinary surgeon, the man who knew, who was wanted, who came to render assistance in time of need. It had never occurred to me how much this affected my outlook every time I walked onto a farm. This wasn't the same thing at all. I had come to take this man's daughter out. He might not like it, might positively resent it. Standing outside the farmhouse door, I took a deep breath. The night was very dark and still. No sound came from the great trees nearby, and only the distant roar of the Darrow disturbed the silence. The recent heavy rains had transformed the leisurely wandering river into a rushing torrent, which in places overflowed its banks and flooded the surrounding pastures. I was shown into the large kitchen by Helen's young brother. The boy had a hand over his mouth in an attempt to hide a wide grin. He seemed to find the situation funny. His little sister, sitting at a table doing her homework, was pretending to concentrate on her writing, but she too wore a fixed smirk as she looked down at her book. Mr. Alderson was reading The Farmer and Stock Breeder, his breeches unlaced, his stockinged feet stretched out towards a blazing pile of logs. He looked up over his spectacles. "Come in, young man, and sit by the fire," he said absently. I had the uncomfortable impression that it was a frequent and boring experience for him to have young men calling for his eldest daughter. I sat down at the other side of the fire, and Mr. Alderson resumed his study of The Farmer and Stock Breed. The ponderous tick-tock of a large wall clock boomed out into the silence. I stared into the red depths of the fire till my eyes began to ache. Then I looked up at a big oil painting in a gilt frame hanging above the mantelpiece. It depicted shaggy cattle standing knee-deep in a lake of an extraordinary bright blue. Behind them loomed a backcloth of fearsome, improbable mountains, their jagged summits wreathed in a sulphurous mist. Averting my eyes from this, I examined, one by one, the sides of bacon and the hams hanging from the rows of hooks in the ceiling. Mr. Alderson turned over a page. The clock ticked on. Over by the tables, spluttering noises came from the children. After about a year, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Then Helen came into the room. She was wearing a blue dress, the kind without shoulder straps that seems to stay up by magic. Her dark hair shone under the single pressure lamp which lit the kitchen, shadowing the soft curves of her neck and shoulders. Over one white arm she held a camel hair coat. I felt stunned. She was like a rare jewel in the rough setting of stone flags and whitewashed walls. She gave me her quiet, friendly smile and walked towards me. "Hello, I hope I haven't kept you waiting too long." I muttered something in reply and helped her on with her coat. She went over and kissed her father, who didn't look up but waved his hand vaguely. There was another outburst of giggling from the table. We went out. In the car I felt unusually tense, and for the first mile or two had to depend on some inane remarks about the weather to keep a conversation going. I was beginning to relax when I drove over a little humpback bridge into a dip in the road. Then the car suddenly stopped. The engine coughed gently, and then we were sitting silent and motionless in the darkness. And there was something else. My feet and ankles were freezing cold. "My God," I shouted, "we've run into a bit of flooded road. The water's right into the car." I looked round at Helen. "I'm terribly sorry about this. Your feet must be soaked." But Helen was laughing. She had her feet tucked up on the seat, her knees under her chin. "Yes, I'm a bit wet, but it's no good sitting about like this. Hadn't we better start pushing?" Wading out into the black icy waters was a nightmare, but there was no escape. Mercifully it was a little car, and between us we managed to push it beyond the flooded patch. Then by torchlight I dried the plugs and got the engine going again. Helen shivered as we squelched back into the car. "I'm afraid I'll have to go back and change my shoes and stockings, and so will you. There's another road back through Fensley. You take the first turn on the left." Back at the farm, Mr. Alderson was still reading the Farmer and Stock Breeder, and kept his finger on the list of pig prices while he gave me a baleful glance over his spectacles. When he learned that I had come to borrow a pair of his shoes and socks, he threw the paper down in exasperation and rose, groaning, from his chair. He shuffled out of the room, and I could hear him muttering to himself as he mounted the stairs. Helen followed him, and I was left alone with the two young children. They studied my sodden trousers with undisguised delight. I had wrung most of the surplus water out of them, but the final result was remarkable. Mrs. Hall's knife-edge crease reached to just below the knee, but then there was chaos. The trousers flared out at that point in a crumpled, shapeless mess, and as I stood by the fire to dry them, a gentle steam rose about me. The children stared at me, wide-eyed and happy. This was a big night for them. Mr. Alderson reappeared at length and dropped some shoes and rough socks at my feet. I pulled on the socks quickly, but shrank back when I saw the shoes. They were a pair of dancing slippers from the early days of the century, and their cracked patent leather was topped by wide black silk bows. I opened my mouth to protest, but Mr. Alderson had dug himself deep into his chair and had found his place again among the pig prices. I had the feeling that if I asked for another pair of shoes, Mr. Alderson would attack me with the poker. I put the slippers on. We had to take a roundabout road to avoid the floods, but I kept my foot down, and within half an hour we had left the steep sides of the dale behind us and were heading out onto the rolling plain. I began to feel better. We were making in good time, and the little car, shuddering and creaking, was going well. I was just thinking that we wouldn't be all that late when the steering wheel began to drag to one side. I had a puncture most days and recognised the symptoms immediately. I had become an expert at changing wheels, and with a word of apology to Helen was out of the car like a flash. With my rapid manipulation of the rusty jack and brace, the wheel was off within 3 minutes. The surface of the crumpled tyre was quite smooth except for the lighter, frayed parts where the canvas showed through. Working like a demon, I screwed on the spare, cringing inwardly as I saw that this tyre was in exactly the same condition as the other. I steadfastly refused to think of what I would do if its frail fibres should give up the struggle. By day, the Reniston dominated Broughton like a vast medieval fortress, bright flags fluttering arrogantly from its 4 turrets, but tonight it was like a dark cliff with a glowing cavern at street level where the Bentleys discharged their expensive cargoes. I didn't take my vehicle to the front entrance, but tucked it away quietly at the back of the car park. A magnificent commissionaire opened the door for us, and we trod noiselessly over the rich carpeting of the entrance hall. We parted there to get rid of our coats, and in the men's cloakroom I scrubbed frantically at my oily hands. It didn't do much good. Changing that wheel had given my fingernails a border of deep black which defied ordinary soap and water, and Helen was waiting for me. I looked up in the mirror at the white-jacketed attendant hovering behind me with a towel. The man, clearly fascinated by my ensemble, was staring down at the wide-bowed Pierrot shoes and the rumpled trouser bottoms. As he handed over the towel, he smiled broadly, as if in gratitude for this little bit of extra colour in his life. I met Helen in the reception hall, and we went over to the desk. "What time does the dinner dance start?" I asked. The girl at the desk looked surprised. "I'm sorry, sir. There's no dance tonight. We only have them once a fortnight." I turned to Helen in dismay, but she smiled encouragingly. "It doesn't matter," she said. "I don't really care what we do." "We can have dinner anyway," I said. I tried to speak cheerfully, but a little black cloud seemed to be forming just above my head. Was anything going to go right tonight? I could feel my morale slumping as I padded over the lush carpet, and my first sight of the dining room didn't help. It looked as big as a football field, with great marble pillars supporting a carved-painted ceiling. The Reniston had been built in the late Victorian period, and all the opulence and ornate splendour of those days had been retained in this tremendous room. Most of the tables were occupied by the usual clientele, a mixture of the county aristocracy and industrialists from the West Riding. I had never seen so many beautiful-looking women and masterful-looking men under one roof, and I noticed with a twinge of alarm that though the men were wearing everything from dark lounge suits to hairy tweeds, there wasn't another dinner jacket in sight. A majestic figure in white tie and tails bore down on us. With his mane of white hair falling back from the lofty brow, the bulging waistline, the hooked nose, an imperious expression, he looked exactly like a Roman emperor. His eyes flickered expertly over me, and he spoke tonelessly. "You want a table, sir?" "Yes, please," I mumbled, only just stopping myself saying "sir" to the man in return. "A table for 2. "Are you staying, sir?" This question baffled me. How could I possibly have dinner here if I wasn't staying? "Yes, I am staying." The Emperor made a note on a pad. "This way, sir." He began to make his way with great dignity among the tables, while I followed abjectly in his wake with Helen. It was a long way to the table, and I tried to ignore the heads which turned to have a second look at me as I passed. It was Mrs. Hall's gusset that worried me most, and I imagined it standing out like a beacon below the short jacket. It was literally burning my buttocks by the time we arrived. The table was nicely situated, and a swarm of waiters descended on us, pulling out our chairs and settling us into them, shaking out our napkins and spreading them on our laps. When they had dispersed, the Emperor took charge again. He poised a pencil over his pad. "May I have your room number, sir?" I swallowed hard and stared up at him over my dangerously billowing shirt front. "Room number? Oh, I'm not living in the hotel." "Ah, not staying." He fixed me for a moment with an icy look before crossing out something on the pad with unnecessary violence. He muttered something to one of the waiters and strode away. It was about then that the feeling of doom entered into me. The black cloud over my head spread and descended, enveloping me in a dense cloud of misery. The whole evening had been a disaster and would probably get worse. I must have been mad to come to this sumptuous place dressed up like a knockabout comedian. I was as hot as hell inside this ghastly suit, and the stud was biting viciously into my neck. I took a menu card from a waiter and tried to hold it with my fingers curled inwards to hide my dirty nails. Everything was in French, and in my numbed state the words were largely meaningless. But somehow I ordered the meal, and as we ate, I tried desperately to keep a conversation going. But long deserts of silence began to stretch between us. It seemed that only Helen and I were quiet among all the surrounding chatter and laughter and chatter. Worst of all was the little voice which kept telling me that Helen had never really wanted to come out with me anyway. She had done it out of politeness and was getting through a boring evening as best she could. The journey home was a fitting climax. We stared straight ahead as the headlights picked out the winding road back into the dales. We made stumbling remarks, then the strange silence took over again. By the time we drew up outside the farm, my head had begun to ache. We shook hands, and Helen thanked me for a lovely evening. There was a tremor in her voice, and in the moonlight her face was anxious and withdrawn. I said good night, got into the car, and drove away. Chapter 18. If only my car had had any brakes, I would certainly have enjoyed looking down on Wharton village from the high moor. The old stone houses, straggling unevenly along the near bank of the river, made a pleasant splash of grey on the green floor of the valley, and the little gardens, with their dipped lawns, gave a touch of softness to the bare rising sweep of the fellside on the other side of the dale. But the whole scene was clouded by the thought that I had to get down that road with its 1 in 4 gradient and those 2 villainous S-bends. It was like a malevolent snake coiling almost headlong from where I sat. And, as I said, I had no brakes. Of course, the vehicle had originally been fitted with the means of bringing it to a halt, and during most of the year I had ridden in it a violent pressure on the pedal would have the desired effect, even though it caused a certain amount of veering about on the road. But lately the response had been growing weaker, and now it was nil. During the gradual deterioration, I had brought the matter up with Siegfried now and then, and he had expressed sympathy and concern. "That won't do at all, James. I'll have a word with Hammond about it. Leave it with me." And then a few days later, when I made a further appeal, "Oh, Lord, yes. I've been meaning to fix it up with Hammond. Don't worry, James, I'll see to it." Finally, I had to tell him that when I put my foot on the pedal, there was nothing at all, and the only way I had of stopping the car was to crash it into bottom gear. "Oh, bad luck, James. Must be a nuisance for you, but never mind. I'll arrange everything." Some time later I asked Mr. Hammond down at the garage if he had heard anything from Siegfried, but he hadn't. The motorman did, however, hop into the car and drive it slowly down the street. He came to a jerking, shuddering halt about 50 yards away, and then got out. He made no attempt to back up, but walked thoughtfully towards me. Normally an imperturbable man, he had gone rather pale, and he looked at me wonderingly. "And you mean to tell me, lad, that you do all your rounds in that car?" "Well, yes, I do." "You ought to have a medal. Then I daren't drive across Market Place in that bloody thing." There wasn't much I could do. The car was Siegfried's property, and I'd have to await his pleasure. Of course, I had had experience of this sort of thing before in the shape of the movable passenger seat he had in his own vehicle when I first came to Darrowby. He never seemed to notice when I went over backwards every time I sat in it, and I don't suppose he would ever have done anything about it but for an instant one market day, when he noticed an old lady with a large basket of vegetables walking into Darrowby, and courteously offered her a lift. Poor old girl's feet went straight back up in the air, and she just disappeared into the back. Had a hell of a job getting her out. Thought we'd have to get a block and tackle. Cabbages and cauliflower rolling all over the place. I looked again down the deep, steep track. The sensible thing, of course, would be to go back into Darrowby and take the low road into Wharton. No danger that way, but it meant a round trip of nearly 10 miles, and I could actually see the small Holden I wanted to visit just 1,000 feet below. The calf with joint illness was in that shed with the green door. In fact, there was old Mr. Robinson coming out of the house now and pottering across the yard with a bucket. I could almost reach out and touch him. I thought not for the first time that if you had to drive a car with no brakes, one of the last places in England you'd want to be was the Yorkshire Dales. Even on the flat it was bad enough, but I got used to it after a week or two and often forgot all about it. As when one day I was busy with a cow and the farmer jumped into my car to move it so that one of his men could get past with a tractor. I never said a word as the unsuspecting man backed round quickly and confidently and hit the wall of the barn with a sickening crash. With typical Yorkshire understatement, all he said was, "Your brakes aren't a savage, mister." Anyway, I had to make up my mind. Was it to be back to Darrowby or straight over the top? It had become a common situation, and every day I had the experience of sitting wrestling with myself on the edge of a hill, with my heart thumping as it was now. There must have been scores of these unwitnessed dramas played out in the green silence of the fells. At last I started the engine and did what I always did, took the quick way down. But this hill really was a beauty, a notorious road even in this country, and as I nosed gently onto it, the whole world seemed to drop away from me. With the gear lever in bottom and my hand jammed against it, I headed, dry-mouthed, down the strip of tarmac which now looked to be almost vertical. It is surprising what speed you can attain in bottom gear if you have nothing else to hold you back, and as the first bend rushed up at me, the little engine started a rising scream of protest. When I hit the curve, I hauled the wheel round desperately to the right. The tyres spun for a second in the stones and loose soil of the verge, then we were off again. This was a longer stretch and even steeper, and it was like being on the Big Dipper with the same feeling of lack of control over one's fate. Hurtling into the bend, the idea of turning at this speed was preposterous, but it was that or straight over the edge. Terror-stricken, I closed my eyes and dragged the wheel to the left. This time one side of the car lifted, and I was sure we were over. Then it rocked back onto the other side, and for a horrible second or two kept this up till it finally decided to stay upright, and I was once more on my way. Again a yawning gradient, but as the car sped downwards, engine howling, I was aware of a curious numbness. I seemed to have reached the ultimate limits of fear, and hardly noticed as we shot round the third bend. One more to go, and at last the road was levelling out. My speed dropped rapidly, and at the last bend I couldn't have been doing more than 20. I had made it. It wasn't till I was right on to the final straight that I saw the sheep, hundreds of them filling the road. A river of woolly backs lapping from wall to wall. They were only yards from me, and I was still going downhill. Without hesitation I turned and drove straight into the wall. There didn't seem to be much damage. A few stones slithered down as the engine stalled and fell silent. Slowly I sank back in my seat, relaxing my clenched jaws, releasing finger by finger the fierce grip on the wheel. The sheep continued to flow past, and I took a sideways glance at the man who was shepherding them. He was a stranger to me, and I prayed he didn't recognise me either, because at that moment the role of unknown madman seemed to be the ideal one. Best not to say anything. Appearing round a corner and driving deliberately into a wall is no basis for a rewarding conversation. The sheep were still passing by, and I could hear the man calling to his dogs, "Get by, Jess, come by, Nell." But I kept up a steady stare at the layered stones in front of me, even though he passed within a few feet. I suppose some people would have asked me what the hell I was playing at, but not a Dale's shepherd. He went quietly by without invading my privacy. When I looked in the mirror after a few moments, I could see him in the middle of the road staring back at me, his sheep temporarily forgotten. My breakless period has always been easy to recall. There is a piercing clarity about the memory which has kept it fresh over the years. I suppose it lasted only a few weeks, but it could have gone on indefinitely if Siegfried himself hadn't become involved. It was when we were going to a case together. For some reason he decided to take my car and settled in the driver's seat. I huddled apprehensively next to him as he set off at his usual brisk pace. Hinchcliffe's farm lies about a mile on the main road outside Darrowby. It is a massive place with a wide straight drive leading down to the house. We weren't going there, but as Siegfried spurted to full speed, I could see Mr. Hinchcliffe in his big Buick ahead of us, proceeding in a leisurely way along the middle of the road. As Siegfried pulled out to overtake, the farmer suddenly stuck out his hand and began to turn right towards his farm directly across our path. Siegfried's foot went hard down on the brake pedal, and his eyebrows shot right up as nothing happened. We were going straight for the side of the Buick, and there was no room to go round to the left. Siegfried didn't panic. At the last moment he turned right with the Buick, and the two cars roared side by side down the drive, Mr. Hinchcliffe staring at me with bulging eyes from close range. The farmer stopped in the yard, but we continued round the back of the house because we had to. Fortunately, it was one of those places where you could drive right round, and we rattled through the stackyard and back to the front of the house behind Mr. Hinchcliffe, who had got out and was looking round the corner to see where we had gone. The farmer whipped round in astonishment and open-mouthed watched us as we passed, but Siegfried, retaining his aplomb to the end, inclined his head and gave a little wave before we shot back up the drive. Before we returned to the main road, I had a look back at Mr. Hinchcliffe. He was still watching us, and there was a certain rigidity in his pose which reminded me of the shepherd. Once on the road, Siegfried steered carefully into a lay-by and stopped. For a few moments he stared straight ahead without speaking, and I realised he was having a little difficulty in getting his patient look properly adjusted. But when he finally turned to me, his face was transfigured, almost saintly. I dug my nails into my palms as he smiled at me with kindly eyes. "Really, James," he said, "I can't understand why you keep things to yourself. Heaven knows how long your car has been in this condition, yet never a word from you." He raised a forefinger, and his patient look was replaced by one of sorrowing gravity. "Don't you realise we might have been killed back there? You really ought to have told me."